Thank you, and good afternoon and good morning to some of our folks, depending on where you are. I wanted to point out the closed captioning and GoToWebinar technical support number. If you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please feel free to call those numbers. I would like to officially welcome you to the NCATS Securing Seed Funding and Support for Entrepreneurs in Research. I also want to thank our collaborators, the NC Biosciences organization and Virginia Bio. NCATS is pleased to partner with you on this effort. We have a couple of key objectives today. We would like to expand awareness about the NCATS, SBIR, and STTR programs and other resources to help foster innovation. We also want to give you some tips to help you be successful in your application, and also, ultimately, increase the number of high-quality applications, especially in geographically diverse states and women and minority-owned businesses. Our job is to help you get the information you need to be successful and submit an application. A quick overview of our agenda. We'll do a review of what are the SBIR and STTR programs. We'll provide tips. We'll go through a case study and also share some additional small business resources. Throughout the course of this presentation, you can share with us your questions by submitting a question through the question feature on the right side of your screen. Please feel free to continue to submit those questions, and we will address them through the Q&A session at the end. We usually get the question about whether this will be shared after the presentation, and we will be sending an email to all registrants so that you have access to this presentation as well. With that said, I would like to welcome and thank our presenter, Lili Portilla, who is the Director of Strategic Alliances at NCATS. Welcome, Lili.
Thanks, Monique, and good afternoon to everyone on the webinar. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what NCATS does. NCATS, of course, is one of the 27 institutes here at the NIH. We are the newest center. We started in 2011, and we conduct and support research on the science and operation of translation to allow more treatments to get to patients quickly. We focus on what's common across diseases and the translational process, and identify bottlenecks in the translational process and try to disseminate that information, our learnings, to the public as well. And in terms of what translational sciences is and how we define it here at NCATS, translation is the process of turning observations from the lab and clinic to improve the health of individuals and the public. But we see translational sciences as a field of investigation focused on understanding scientific and operational principles underlying in each step of the translational process. So if one wants to figure out how to do drug development in a more efficient way, we would be looking to see what in the preclinical realm we could change and affect, and also in the clinical realm, the same thing would apply. What can we do to address bottlenecks in that part of the translational process? So if you're familiar with the NIH SBIR STTR program, you know that it's one of the largest sources of early stage capital for small businesses in the United States. We primarily get most of our applications through the omnibus solicitation, which was just released this month. Standard deadlines are April 5th, April 5th, September 5th, and January 5th. And we also have a few specific solicitations in targeted areas as well too, as well as all the other institutes at the NIH have targeted solicitations. And once a year, we participate in the SBIR contract solicitation, which normally applications are due in the October-November timeframe. So what are the SBIR and STTR programs? SBIR supports early stage R&D projects at small businesses. STTR helps small businesses formally collaborate with a research institution for phase 1 and phase 2. And when I refer to phase 1 and phase 2, those are parts of the SBIR and STTR program. I'm not referring to what FDA calls a phase 1 clinical trial or a phase 2 clinical trial. And again, the SBIR and STTR program helps entrepreneurs with early stage seed funding. So in terms of what NCATS is interested in, our topics of interest are focused in 3 buckets. One is drug discovery and development tools. Another is biomedical and clinical health research informatics and tools related to that. And clinical dissemination and implementation research, we fund tools and technologies in that area. And if I have time at the end of the presentation, I can briefly show you what some of these specific topics look like. So SBIR STTR is a congressionally mandated program which most federal agencies participate in. It's a set-aside program, meaning that we must spend our funds. 3.2% of the total NIH budget goes towards funding small business SBIR program, and 0.45 goes to funding the STTR program. So again, let's talk about the 3 phases of the SBIR STTR program. There's phase 1, which is typically a feasibility study, and the budget guidelines for the program are $150,000 for SBIR and STTR, and the project period is normally 6 months to a year for STTR. I want to point to the budget guidelines here at the NIH. We do have a hard cap at $225,000 for a phase 1, phase 2, and $1.5 million for a phase 2. The phase 2 is full R&D, and again, the guidelines call for $1 million, but we can go up to $1.5 million for SBIR and STTR, and it's normally for a 2-year period of time. The FastTrack is an application process that combines both the phase 1 and phase 2. So you're applying for what you would do under a phase 1 grant as well as a phase 2, meaning that you don't have to go through the review process again, but you do have to show progress in the grant, and we would be looking at that before you, at the time you completed your phase 1 specific aims and moved over to a phase 2. And some institutes here at the NIH participated in a program called Phase 2B, which is a competing renewal program. We have a Phase 2B program. We do ask our grantees, and we'll only fund those grantees where we funded the Phase 2 grant, but it's important that you talk to us before you submit a Phase 2 competing renewal, because we want to make sure that we can support the program going forward and your application. Phase 3 is what generally is what happens, after NIH provides funding in the phase 1 and phase 2 arena. That's your commercialization phase. We're looking for folks to start strategic partnerships and potentially get follow-on funding from other sources. So here at the NIH, our overall budget is, I think this is 2017 numbers we're looking at here, was $33 billion. So the NIH had, again, congressionally mandated set aside for SBIR and STTR totaling almost $1 billion that the institutes across the NIH are using to support small businesses here in the U.S. So in terms of eligibility for SBIR, the criteria for applying to SBIR is that you must be a U.S.-based company with 500 or fewer employees. The PI's primary employment is with a small business at the time of award and during the entire duration of the project. More than 50% U.S.-owned of the business must be owned by individuals or independently operated, or more than 50% can be owned and controlled by other business concerns. that are 50% owned and controlled by one or more individuals, or the other scenario is that more than 50% owned by multiple venture capital operating companies, hedge funds, and private equity firms. And the eligibility really comes into play at the time of award. So all these points here will be cross-checked at the time that you are slated to get the award. So we want to make sure that at the time of award that you have that you meet all of these eligibility criteria. For STTR, it's a slightly different. It's an established cooperative and development effort needs to be delineated where at least 40% of the small business concern and at least 30% of a U.S. college or university or nonprofit organization is part of the collaboration. You need to have a formalized IP agreement at the time of award that shows that you have the necessary intellectual property rights to carry out the R&D and commercialization aspect of what you're putting together in the grant. And the primary employment of the principal investigator is either with the small business or the research institution. But the award always goes to the small business in either one of these scenarios. The benefits of the SBIR and STTR program is, as I've said before, that it's one of the largest funding sources for early stage life sciences in the country. It's stable and predictable, again, because it's linked to our overall budget. IP rights are retained by the small business. We do not consider this a loan or expect you to pay it back, and so it's non-dilutive capital. And I think one of the added benefits of the program is that your project goes through rigorous scientific peer review process, which many of our awardees leverage to attract additional funding. And sometimes they can do it simply by showing their summary statement and the very competitive score that they received in order to get follow-on funding from other sources. So this slide shows a good representation of the differences between the two SBIR and STTR. SBIR permits partnering, but STTR again requires that you're collaborating with a nonprofit research institution here in the U.S. The work requirements are a little bit different. In terms of outsourcing, you can outsource 33% of the phase 1 and 50% of the phase 2 award. And the minimum work requirements for an STTR are, as I said, 40% to the small business and 30% to the research institution partner. And the difference between the principal investigator is that the primary employment for that principal investigator can be with an STTR either with the research institution or the small business. With the SBIR, it's always with the small business. But I will add that you can have multiple PIs under an SBIR award, and those PIs can also be from research institutions as well too. But again, the award is always made to the small business, not the academic research institution. NCATS, for the most part, gets the most of its applications through what we call the omnibus parent SBIR STTR grant solicitation. We encourage you to look on our website and see the different types of topics that we look for here at NCATS, as well as what our other sister agencies and institutes look for. There is a very helpful web link within the solicitation called the Program Descriptions and Research Topics. It's a very comprehensive document, almost 200 pages of topics across all of the 24 institutes that participate in the program, as well as our sister agencies in the CDC and FDA. And again, the standard deadlines across the board are April 5th, September 5th, and January 5th. In terms of review criteria, it's very similar to what you might find within an R01 grant. NIH is going to, its peer review is going to look at scoring the significance of the grant, you know, what's the commercial potential of what you're proposing, what your investigative team, what does it look like? Do you have the right expertise in place? In terms of innovation, is this an improvement? or is it a brand new approach to a particular problem? We'll look at your research design and the feasibility of what you're doing, and again, also assess your research facilities and resources that you're going to be bringing to the table. We may review but not score individually things like protection of human subjects, inclusion of women and minorities in clinical trials, and vertebrate animals and biohazards. Again, typically these are not scored, but these will occasionally be commented on by the reviewers. So how long does it take to get an application funded? So if we look at the next solicitation date, which is April 5th, you submit your application by then, and you could expect scientific review to happen sometime in the June-July timeframe. Our council will meet in either end of August or beginning of September, and then we would probably not be able to award the grant probably towards the end of the fiscal year, which is the September timeframe, or perhaps into the next fiscal year, which would be more in October. So we're talking anywhere between 7 to 8 months in making an award at the time you submit the application, at the time that we can go ahead and you'll get the money for the award. One of the things that I'm just going to go through some tips in terms of how to apply to the program. I think one of the key things and that should have most of the information about the specific funding announcement that you're applying is to read that announcement very carefully to make sure that the focus of what you're doing really is aligned with the funding announcement. We are required to put down points of contact to have discussions. I encourage folks to talk to program officers before they apply to make sure that what they're applying to really makes sense for that specific funding announcement or institute. There's also, if you go on the NIH website, there's a very handy resource tab that you can actually pull up a successful application. One of our grantees has made that available for the community to look at, and you can get a sense of what a successful application looks like. Also, you might want to look at the NIH Reporter, which is a comprehensive list of all grants that the NIH has grants and contracts that the NIH has funded, awarded, and you can get a sense of what types of applications an institute is currently supporting. And all that information is made to the public, and I guess this gives you a good sense of to understand what a specific institute is looking for, and see the differences between the various institutes at NIH in terms of what they would support in funding in their SBIR and STTR portfolio. And again, I can't stress this enough that you really should be engaging with one of the institute program officers early in the process, again, to make sure that your application is a good scientific fit for that organization. You also may find out from them about specific initiatives that and targeted solicitations that are perfectly, set up for you to apply to, because they address the problem that you're trying to, put together in your grant. And I would suggest having this conversation again early, at least a month before the due date. We are very busy, I would say 3 to 4 weeks before an application date. We are swamped with calls, and it's best to have those conversations early in the process, because unfortunately you may get into a situation where you're not able to have a conversation with one of the program officers if you wait too long. Some other tips are to register early for the SBIR STTR electronic submission process. Use NIH Assist, which is a tool that we have that streamlines the application process. This is a really useful tool, especially if you have never applied to the NIH. It kind of walks you through the application process. You can also specify the institute that you would like to apply to. So if you speak to me and I tell you that the application is a really good fit for NCATS, I would encourage you to list NCATS as your primary institute. And that would go for my other institutes here. Once you speak to the program officer and you know that it's a good fit, put that down in your request form. And also check out the list of study sections that the Center for Scientific Review has on their website, and you can get a sense of the types of applications that these study sections are reviewing. You can also get a sense of what the roster looks like and who is participating in the review process. And again, submit early, not days and hours before the submission process. It's a trap door that we see some of our applicants get into, which is that they wait to the last minute and then there is some issue with their registration, or the pagination has kicked the application out because there's too many pages. So these are things that you can fix if you submit early, as opposed to submitting hours and a day before the application due date. So I think this slide here summarizes what we view as the common application problems. I think one of the ones that we see the most is that the reviewers believe that it's a nice solution, but you don't make a convincing case for what the commercial potential or the biomedical impact would be on what you're proposing. Also, we see comments around lack of innovation, diffuse or unfocused research plan going in a lot of different directions. I mean, you have to make sure that what you put together is commensurate with the budgets that are required, limits that we have for these programs. We also have seen that there's related to that, there's an unrealistic large amount of work that people are proposing that just cannot be done with the budgets that you are expected to get under a phase 1 or a phase 2. A lot of comments that I have seen in the past have to do with the investigative team that's been put together. You don't need to be a PhD or MD to apply to the program, but if you are going to be doing, clinical research, you should have a proper clinician involved in the project that has the right expertise to carry out those specific aims where that expertise is needed. So important facts to remember about the program. Again, eligibility is determined at the time of award. Specifically for an STTR, I also want to say that IP agreement that you need to show that you have access to the intellectual property does not need to be in place until the time of award. So at the time of award, we will confirm whether all these, that you're still eligible to receive the award, that you have a proper IP agreement. We'll make sure that you have a proper lease with an incubator or wherever to conduct the research. As I said, the PI is not required to have an MD or PhD, but you are expected to have a proper team with the right expertise to oversee the projects in place. And you can submit applications to different agencies for similar work, but there really should be no overlap between what NIH is funding and also perhaps what NSF is funding. So I think it's one of the, comments that we also get is, once you submit and you get a score and you find out that you didn't get reviewed or the score was not that great, what do you do? And I think, again, it's critical that you discuss that summary statement with your NIH program officer to get a sense of what to do. I think the summary statement serves as a great guide to resubmit your application and follow some of the comments that they've made. We've also put here a link to the CSR website so you can get an understanding of what the review process and dynamics look like. And I think in terms of resubmitting an application, spend your time carefully reading that summary statement and then addressing those concerns and revising your aims page when you resubmit the application. We want to make sure that you have all your grant registrations in place before you submit. Some of these registrations can take up to 6 weeks to complete, so that's why you need to start early. And there are 5 different registrations that need to be in place before you submit any grant to the NIH. And they're listed here, and if you go to the website that we've put here, you can get a sense of what they are. And for instance, the SAMS awards management system, which is the way that you get across the government, that you get payment from the government, and this is how the system that you would be getting your award. That registration alone can take up to 6 weeks, because you have to have your tax ID number in place before this you get this registration in place, and it checks those what you put in with IRS systems. So that can take a while to do, and you cannot submit any application to the NIH until all these registrations have been completed. Very quickly, I wanted to talk about one of our success stories here at NCATS. AI Cure is a company that we funded several years ago. It's a medication adherence tool that uses artificial intelligence to confirm that a patient has taken medication. And this is really critical in terms of patients or folks that participate in clinical trials, making sure that they're adhering to the medication schedule that's specified in the clinical trial. I wasn't aware of this, but this seems to be a problem, that even though people participate in clinical trials, sometimes they're not very compliant with taking their medication. But this artificial intelligence app is able to assure that patients are taking their medication. So what this company did was that they received 2 SBIR awards from NCATS, and they were able to attract and leverage an additional $12 million in financing from VC investors. And as a result of that, they were also able to leverage several strategic partnerships with large pharmaceutical companies that do clinical trials as well. So this is a great example of how to leverage your SBIR award into hopefully more financing from other sources other than just the government. Very quickly, I'll go through the other funding sources for small businesses here at the NIH. NIH also offers entrepreneurial support and courses for Phase 1 awardees. We have the I-Corps program where our Phase 1 grantees can participate. Some of the other institutes also participate in one that's geared specifically for medical devices with the Coulter Foundation. Here at NCATS, we have a program called Bridging Interventional Development Gaps, the Bridges program, which is a collaboration between our intramural and extramural labs. It was formerly called the NIH RAID program. But here, the purpose of this program is to get de-risk programs so that they can get to an IND filing. And what we do is we provide a gap analysis to figure out what data needs to be generated to get you to that successful IND filing. Folks enter this program when they have a clinical candidate identified, and any disease area and modality as well is eligible to participate in the program. Academic, small business, SBIR eligible companies can participate in this de-risking program. And I want to stress that this is not a grant program, it's a resource program. So what you're getting access to is expertise and resources. And I'll give you an example of how that works in a few minutes. Okay, the next program is the Therapeutics for Rare and Neglected Diseases program, TREND. TREND actually can get you past an IND filing up to a Phase 2A clinical trial. the difference between Trend and Bridges is that Trend only takes those diseases that meet FDA orphan drug designation or WHO neglected tropical disease criteria. So you either have to be in the rare or neglected disease space to participate in this program. And it's open to small business, academics, and also outside the U.S. As well too. And here we do a gap analysis on what you need in order to get your drug or whatever it is to the next stage, so that you could get a strategic partnership or to a key inflection point, whether it be more additional funding, an IND filing, whatever that is. You work very closely with our project managers and our team here in providing some of that assistance to get you to a key inflection point. So here's an example this is an actual example of somebody that participated in the program. This was an academic investigator who had developed a new compound for a treatment of a rare disease, and they had done some of that early stage research using R01 support as well as STTR funding that totaled up, $3.5 million. They went to the FDA in order to file the IND, and the FDA said to them that they needed these two preclinical studies, tox studies done in order to get them to an IND. And this particular investigator had a really hard time trying to get these two preclinical studies done. It's typically not something that you can do under an R01 grant, and they just had, they totaled up about $500,000. So they came to the Bridges program, who helped them get the studies done, and as a result of that, they successfully filed an IND and were able to raise around $50 million in VC Series A funding. So this is how this particular investigator leveraged SBIR, STTR money, and then came to Bridges to kind of help them through this valley of death. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Lili. We have quite a few questions. Thank you for that presentation. One question is, there are SBIR and STTRs across the NIH. How do we know which one to apply to if our technology touches multiple disease areas? And would my application be forwarded to another institute if there's a better fit?
So I'll speak specifically to how we work here at NCATS. We encourage our applicants, before they submit an application to us, to talk to us to make sure that, number one, it's a good fit. If you're not a good fit for NCATS, I will suggest to you who to talk to at some of the other institutes. And yes, sometimes applications span across various institutes, and I think that's where having a conversation with the program officer is so critical, because what you might find out in that conversation is that one particular institute sees that as a very high priority, wants the application, and that's communicated to you. And you can have some of the other institutes listed as secondaries in the event there's co-funding that's needed, or just to show that there's other interest in the application. So again, having that conversation early to determine which institute is the best fit and who is most enthusiastic about your application is so critical to finding the right home for your application and hopefully eventual funding.
Thank you, Lili. The next question is about the success rates for SBIR and STTR at NCATS. Is there a current pay line?
Our pay line, being that we are a new institute compared to the rest of NIH, we've been around for 6 years, our pay line has been shifting a lot. And what I mean by that is it's gotten very competitive, whereas we may have looked at, as an example, scores going in the 40s. We are now looking for scores, funding scores in the 30s, and that's changed again because people are applying. It's become more competitive to apply to us. In terms of success rates, that's made public on the NIH website. So if you wanted to get a sense of what that looks like, You can go to the NIH website and see what the different success rates are across the institutes for the various funding mechanisms that NIH has.
And that website is SBIR.nih.gov/statistics/award-data, and I'll also include that in the chat. The next question is about FastTrack. Does this mean that the combined time frame is 2.5 years with a budget guide of $1.15 million, or is it not additive?
So for a FastTrack, yes, the time period could be for your phase 1, 6 months. Your award for that would be $225,000, and then for the phase 2, the time period could be 2 years with an award for the phase 2 of 1.5, which is the NIH hard cap. So it's $225 for the phase 1 and 1.5 for the phase 2. And one thing that I did not mention, which is very important, I talked about the program description guide that's linked to the omnibus solicitation. There are some topics across the NIH that NIH has designated as high priority topics, or topics that we believe that the current budget caps cannot really cover the work that's done. So there may be waivers that allow you to go above the budget caps of 225 and 1.5 for the phase 2. So we encourage you to look at that document because, for example, at NCATS, if you look at our waive topics list that we have in that document, what you'll see is that we do, for these waive topics, we will allow up to $325K for the phase 1 and up to $2 million for a phase 2, but it has to be in the specified waive topics. And each institute has their own topics and their own budget limitations. So again, read that document very carefully regarding your specific project area that you're looking at.
Thank you. The next question is about rejection. If an application is rejected, could you provide guidance on the pros and cons of doing a resubmission versus a new proposal?
I think, again, based on my experience with our grantees that we have funded here at NCATS, I would say the majority of them go for a resubmission of the application, and a significant amount of them end up scoring better than what they did before, and they use that summary statement as their guide to, beef up the application. And I'll add that review will look at a resubmission and make sure that you've addressed some of the concerns that the earlier review had. When I have seen folks do a different application is when they're really going to change the focus of the application. Their specific aims are going to be they're going to use a different approach, and that could be because the review intimated that that's what they should do. So I think to say that one versus the other, it's best that you kind of look at the totality of what you're trying to do. If you are going to go in a different direction and change the specific aims significantly, then maybe perhaps a new submission is the way to go. And the best way to proceed is probably just having a conversation with the program officer who can guide you on that.
Thank you. What types of projects typically get funded for phase 1 for a new drug? Is this for preclinical animal testing and phase 2 funds for a phase 1 clinical trial in humans?
Again, based on NCATS's experience, we see preclinical development in the phase 1, but we also see it in the phase 2 because we know that developing a novel compound, it's the long haul, and we don't expect people to be doing clinical work in their phase 2 unless, of course, they're getting some additional funding from other sources. But most of the companies that we fund are continuing their preclinical development in the phase 2 of the part of the award. And I'd like to add that it's important that you check with the institute that you're applying to. And specifically here at NCATS, we are not accepting applications that are doing clinical research as defined by the FDA in our program. Other institutes have different policies similar to ours. Others will only accept clinical trials under specific funding announcements. So if that's a direction that you expect to be headed in with your SBIR, STTR, it's again important to check with that respective institute that you're applying to make sure and understand what their funding policies are. And if you look at the new omnibus solicitation, you're going to notice something different, which is that there is a clinical trial accepted funding announcement and one that does not accept clinical trials. So you need to look at that carefully as well too.
Related to that, if you get funded for one institute for a particular phase, may you switch to another for another phase? For example, if they want to start off with NCATS, and then when they get to the clinical trial phase, move to another institute. Is that possible?
Yeah, it is possible. And I would also add the caveat that in that instance, it's good to talk to the other institute that you intend to shift the application over early to make sure that there isn't an issue with doing that. Some institutes like to see continuity in their funding in terms of funding phase 1s and phase 2s. Some institutes don't care. For us in particular, we have accepted applications from other that originally started as phase 1s and then come here to us as phase 2. But that's because it was a good fit for us and it made sense, and we had an offline conversation with the other transferring institute to make sure that they were okay with it. So contact your program officer for guidance in that area.
Perfect. So the next set of questions relate to the company and the team that we put together. Can you tell us more about the role a nonprofit can play and leverage in the SBIR and STTR arena? So
a nonprofit can, a nonprofit is not precluded from working under an SBIR or STTR. I will say that an STTR does provide for the collaboration to happen directly with that research institution. And there's many ways that they can be engaging with the research institution. That particular investigator may have a specific expertise or a very novel animal model or access to patients. So there's different ways that research institutions can participate. But it's not to say that under an SBIR that scenario couldn't happen again. It's just that particular research institution is not going to be the principal investigator of the grant. They could be a co-PI perhaps, but it would really depend on what is going to happen under the grant. And again, that conversation with the program officer is really key.
Thank you. For an STTR, can a partnering research institution be a non-US academic research institution?
That's a really high bar. In our experience, the main focus of SBIR STTR is to really fund, U.S.-based small businesses and research institutions. In the event of foreign institutions being involved, it would have to clear a hurdle from the perspective that there is something unique that institution can only offer. So it could be that particular institution has, let's say the application is around the area of rare diseases, and that particular non-US based institution has access to a significant amount of patients that have this rare disease. An exception could be made around that, but again, it's a really high bar, and we look at these on a case-by-case basis, and I would say for the most part that those are exceptions rather than the norm for with our experience here in the program.
Thank you. One of our participants has a company based in the U.S., but the founders are not American. Does that not count as 50% American, even if the main investigator for the grant is American? Just as some background, the work is going to be conducted in the U.S., and the leadership of the company are international founders.
So the PI, it must be a U.S. company organized here in the U.S. The PI does not have to be a U.S. citizen. but the company needs to be done here and the work needs to be done in the US. So based on the fact pattern that was just given to me, I would say that would be okay. But, you know, with that said, that's probably a good conversation to have ahead of time with your specific program officer.
What is the minimum size of a team? Is a faculty researcher and postdoc sufficient, for example?
It depends. It depends on what the specific aims of the grant are, what's going to be done. It could be enough, but that's a hard question to answer without looking at what's being contemplated under the grant.
Thank you. What's the difference between multiple PI and co-PI?
Well, multiple PI is exactly what, you know, it says there's various principal investigators involved with the grant bringing some specific expertise to the collaboration that's going to be done under the SBIR STTR grant. A co-PI is listed as a co-PI, so it's Investigator Smith from, you know, representing the small business, and perhaps Investigator you know, Portilla doing the other work, and there is one that small business PI is going to be predominantly the point of contact for issues regarding the grant, but you can have more than one listed formal PI on the grant.
Thank you. Is there a minimum size of a team? And then also, does there need to be evidence of experience in commercializing research? How much experience is necessary?
I'm not sure if the evidence is of experience in commercializing something is critical. And I'm not going to say that that's not important, but I think what's more important is that you can demonstrate that there's a commercial need for your product. And that's going to be looked at when you do your phase 2. A big part of that application is the commercialization plan and doing your research on that. And that doesn't necessarily, you know, say that you have to have commercial experience. It's just that you need to explain what your commercial market is, how you intend to get there, who your potential customers are, and things like that.
Thank you. The next set of questions relate to IP. Non-dilutive funding was listed as a benefit of the program. To confirm, will NCATS not take ownership of IP and the funds do not have to be paid back to NCATS?
That's correct. What you invent is yours. We are not asking for reach through to that intellectual property.
Regarding IP, does it mean that the company must have a license at the time of award or a letter from the university saying that the company is in negotiation phase? Is that sufficient?
We would want to make sure that you have access. So saying that you're in negotiate at the time of award. Okay, so let's be specific. At the time of award, we want to make sure that you have access to that IP. So we want to get a letter saying that you have a completed license and that you have access to it. Under negotiation, I don't think that would pass muster here at NCATS in terms of meeting that requirement.
Thank you. A few questions about funding focus. Can you provide tips or guidance for transitioning from a phase 1 award or applying to a phase 2 grant?
So as I said, the phase 1 was feasibility studies, and remember the dollar amount is $225 for a hard cap. So if you looked, this is where looking at that application that we have on site actually would be really on our website might be very useful, because you could get a sense of what those applicants did in their phase 1 feasibility studies, the types of things that they did, and how they transitioned over to the phase 2, which, you know, included more specific studies that they needed to get done and things like that. Each project is going to be different in terms of what the end game is, so might be good to talk to your program officer about that too.
Do you award grants focused on early stage approaches or methods for drug repurposing?
We do, yes, we do. We do like repurposing programs, and I will say specifically that we like repurposing around rare diseases. That's an area of great interest to NCATS. Around the repurposing issue, I just want to say that if your program had a really, really strong oncology focus, I may think that you may be better suited to go to NCI as opposed to NCATS, but that's why having the discussion with us as an initial discussion might be a good place to start. We would want to know what class of diseases you're looking at, things like that. So, but repurposing as a whole is of interest to us. If you're repurposing for rare diseases, that's even more, that's definitely in our sweet spot.
Can you share more information about what funding can be used for? For example, can it be used only for direct R&D costs? Can some portion be used to cover company salaries?
Some salaries can be covered, and that's all. That guidance is provided on the NIH website in terms of how much of that can be covered. And if you're going to be contracting out, it also specifies how much you can contract out to third-party sources, and there's a limitation on that. And that, again, is going to get looked at very closely at the time of award to make sure that you're within your limits.
When a company gets notification that they have been accepted, how do you draft an award agreement, and how is that paid out? Is it lump sum, monthly, by milestones?
So the award for the phase 1 is going to be made in a lump sum, and then you're expected to provide a report, you know, at the end of your award. And I'm assuming that you're going to be doing this within a year's time frame. Okay. If for a phase 2, it's multiple years. So every year you would be expecting to get the next bolus of money based on what your yearly budget is that you've delineated in your grant. And before that award, so if you have a phase 2 and it's a multiple year award, before we make that award, we want to make sure that you're on target, that things are moving along, and the program officer would informs our budget office, and then that those monies are made available to you for the following year.
Would it be reasonable to apply for a phase 1 SBIR to do toxicology studies of a drug in order to apply for an IND, and a phase 2 for clinical trials as a FastTrack application?
Without knowing too much about the program, I think that's possible, but I guess we'd have to look at you know, the specific. When you talk to your program officer, I think in situations like that, if you already have a draft specific aims page, I think that's the kind of thing that you would want to share with them to get, so that he or she can provide you the best advice in terms of the approach that you want to take in putting the fast track together.
Thank you. We just went through a series of continuous resolutions. Is the SBIR program funded regardless?
Well, you know, yes, it is funded. Yes, we are under a CR, which means that we're working with last year's budget. If things change, then we'll readjust that towards the end of the year, because we do still expect to have you know, that resolved sometime this fiscal year. There are institutes that may not be funding grants to their at their full amount because they're still waiting for the CR situation to get settled. It really depends by program and by institute. But yeah, I'll stop there.
So this question relates to states that may be an EPSCoR state or an IDEA state that may have a geographic underrepresentation in NIH funding. They want to know, how do you find experienced people to help support and run these, to help support the applications for these grants? They don't have some of the expertise in this area like some of the larger states.
That's a great question, and I think I would work closely with my colleagues that run the IDEA program here at NIH to find out if there's some resources within those IDEA states that you know, maybe perhaps you don't know about. State bio organizations may be another resource as well. So I know that some of them do provide some mentoring to small business companies. That's probably best answer with a conversation.
Two more questions came in for topics we previously covered, so I'm going to go back to the teaming. Can you have a remote team or collaborators, and does the team need to be owners in the company?
No, the teams don't need to be owners in the company. The team is, how that's going to be looked at is whether you have the right scientific team assembled to perform the specific aims of the grant. The PI, as I mentioned earlier, does not need to be an MD or PhD, but if you are going to be doing, I don't know, some toxicology studies on there, do you have the right expertise to be able to provide you advice on that? That's going to be looked at when it comes to review.
Thank you. We will take one or two more questions, but I am going to have us turn to the how to contact us. We really do want to make sure that you're getting the information you need to be successful and determine if the NCATS, SBIR and STTR programs are appropriate for you. As Lili mentioned, we do take input and are here to answer your questions. So in addition to the journal website and our social channels, you can also email us directly at NCATS-SBIR-STTR@mail.nih.gov. Now I have one more question. The question is having options to IP over time of the award enough? I just want to ask more specifically.
Oh, so IP options. I think if the university or the research institution can explain what that option is and to us, I think that could be sufficient. But I guess we'd have to wait and see on that specific case, so we need a little bit more information. But we have seen options that have been granted by the research institution to be sufficient enough to address that IP issue.
Thank you. So I did want to note that we are at the conclusion of all the questions we have received. We have really tried to make sure we answered as many as we can, but if you do have other questions, please email us. Also, your feedback is really important to us, so there is a request for your input right at the conclusion of this webinar. With that said, I would like to really again thank our collaborators at NC Bio as well as VA. We couldn't have done this without you, and I also want to thank Lili Portilla for your patience in going through every single question. Again, if you do have more, we're here for you. Please reach out to us.
Thanks, Monique, and thanks to everyone who participated. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach us.